I can't remember specifically who the individual was, but I remember they sent me a letter saying that they wouldn't have been able to do with their program in the Northwest Territories without this program. But while we were at Mineral Roundup at the AME, I've had a couple of people come up to me that thanked us for having this program in place and the other initiatives that we have to promote the mining industry in the Northwest Territories. I don't have to tell the members of this House there's a lot of interest in mining in the Northwest Territories, and as things start to come together, if we get some infrastructure funding to help promote some of these things, I believe that we're going in the right direction with the programs that we have in place. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Tesser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Minister for that update. I'm a great supporter of this important subsidy program to our mining industry. I wanted to also turn to secondary diamonds. My honourable friend from Yellowknife North was bringing up, was just scratching the surface of some of these issues. The Minister announced the establishment of a new secondary diamond operation with much fanfare, and we haven't had many updates since then. So what action is the department taking to help move this process along and eliminate this immigration roadblock? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testard. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I said, the holdup on this whole thing is around the federal immigration process, and we, as a department, sent a letter to their agent saying we were supportive of their application for their immigration process, and we will continue to monitor that going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Tesser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we do have our own territorial nominee program. Is there any overlap with the territorial nominee program administered through Education, Culture, Employment that we can use to expedite this process? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testard. Deputy Minister Jensen.
Mr. Chair, the individuals that are coming to work with Almod are coming here on a temporary basis to be able to get the plant up and running, and also to start to train local residents of Yellowknife to be able to learn how to cut the diamond the way they need to have it cut. So they're coming here through a program called, I think it's called Expedited Economic Immigration. So it's not through the nominee program, but it is through an expedited program that the federal government offers. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Minister Jensen. Mr. Tesler.
Thank you for that clarification from the witness. So has any since the purchase of the assets, has any diamond polishing gone on in the last fiscal? And this, since the minister announced the almond deal, has there been any actual work at these facilities? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tessler. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Tessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Northwest Territories Geological Survey has a significant decrease in its budget. Can the minister just speak to what that represents? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tessler. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's primarily due to a sunset from the federal government for a cost-shared agreement for the slave geological, physical, superficial materials permafrost study. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Tesser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe those are my only questions for this activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Next, we had Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mine is more of a comment to identify and complement the department's maintaining of some additional resources for the petroleum resources. Although the commodity prices are way down and the market demand is way down, but the resource is still here, so I think it's comforting to know that the department is still maintaining some allowance for presence. If we were to view a couple of the advocating trips that I made and promoting our northern resources by assisting in support of the application for the repair program of the pipeline repair in Fort Simpson, which has a budget of $53 million. Now, given the fact that it's looking like it's going to be approved and everything looks fine with the permitting regulatory process, and you come back and say, okay, well, look at the numbers on the program detail you've allowed quite consistently based on the mains of 1718 and 1819 of 1.4. I would say that's a pretty good return to promote your northern resources, given the fact that that some presence from the N.W.T Petroleum Office was there in Fort Simpson doing the same thing. So I just point that out to say that I think we should maintain some sort of petroleum allowance, whether it's having staff here in the north and whether it's going to the petroleum show in Calgary. As long as we're maintaining a presence, I think it'll show industry that we're in support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the member for his comments. We have 7 positions right now in that division, and I don't anticipate us cutting any of them. We have a number of things moving forward that we have to have people in these positions. We're going to be coming out with our strategy here very shortly on the Petroleum Resource Act. We have the Oil and Gas Operations Act that has to be maintained as well. As the member said, with Line 21 possibly coming on, but there's also, I think, with this shutdown, it's made us kind of open our eyes and ears on the reclamation side of things, and we got to start thinking about that stuff going forward as well. So the department has a number of things that they have to continue to work on, and we will keep the staff accordingly as we have in place right now going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. McNeely. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering if the minister can tell us whether he's got a check for Mactung yet. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I don't. No.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Well, that's an honest answer. So what's happening with the property? Are we actually trying to market this property yet, or what's happening? Because we've had it now for probably, 2 years? So what's happening? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as the member knows, Mactung is probably one of the world's largest undeveloped concentrations of tungsten in the world. We are working on a marketing plan going forward right now, and we're anticipating to have that ready by the summer of 2018. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Could he share that marketing plan then with Standing Committee? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Yes, when we have it completed, we can certainly do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Okay, that's great. So I know the minister's really anxious to look at the oil and gas legislation as well. Are we going to be considering the royalty regime during the review of that legislation. He promised to do that with the mining legislation, but it's been pushed off now till the 19th Assembly. But we're going to be looking at the royalties with regard to oil and gas. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, first of all, we'll comment on the Mineral Resource Act's royalty. Part of it was through discussions in our public engagement, and then once we got to the Intergovernmental Council, that's where the decision was made to put that on hold on the royalties. And as far as the Oil and Petroleum Resource Act going forward and the Oil and Gas Operations Act, we'll have our public engagement sessions as well, and then we will be meeting probably exactly the same thing with the Intergovernmental Council, having those discussions with them. And I couldn't comment at this point if the royalty part of this will be going forward as that initiative, but not until those conversations take place. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I hate to think that we're going to get all the way through that one too, and then find out that royalties for oil and gas are going to be hived off to the next Assembly as well. But let's talk then about the royalty regime for mining. The Minister has said that it's the Indigenous governments themselves that have been pushing our government to delay the review of the royalty regime for mining. Can the Minister share some of that correspondence with committee then, so we can see that for ourselves? Because I'm aware that there were several organizations that actually pushed the government to actually review the royalty regime in light of our poor international standing on capturing revenue. So can the Minister share some of this correspondence from the Indigenous governments with Standing Committee where the governments have asked that this be delayed? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll have to look into that and get back to the member if we're able to do that at all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate the Minister undertaking that commitment. I want to turn to page 221, and it shows that there's a contribution ongoing to the N.W.T. Chamber of Mines, $30,000. Looks like it's some kind of core funding. Can the Minister comment on this? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is not core funding for them. This is for them to be able to attend various things like PDEC and AME Mineral Roundup. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So say if other organizations wanted to obtain this kind of funding, I'll just give a couple of examples. Maybe the Council of Canadians or Ecology North, they could apply to the department and get this type of funding as well. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If they were to send me a request, we'd have to take it into consideration and then look at putting it in our next budget. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So is this just like a general pot that's available for different organizations to apply to obtain funding to go to these sorts of conferences? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a specific line item for them, but there could be possibilities of other sources of funding that we could look at doing that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. What other support does the department give? What other financial support does the department give in this activity or other activities to the Chamber of Mines? Are there contributions to the Geoscience Forum Are there additional delegates that are funded in other parts of the ITI budget to allow Chamber of Mines staff or individuals to go to conferences and so on? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if you look in the grants and contribution report that we reported on results for 2016-17, and you go to page 45, it'll have everything listed there that we've expenditures and results for the N.W.T. and Nunavut Chamber of Mines.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So that's not shown though anywhere in the main estimates or the business plan. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So some of the, when the member goes there to the grants contribution page and sees what we contributed to, that amount also came out of page 221 in the business plans, the very first line, Aboriginal Mineral Development Support Program, and then some of it came from other contributions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, in fact, I'm furiously trying to flip through the business plan to find out what page he's talking about. I'm looking at the public version, which seems to only have about 50 pages for ITI, 51 pages, in fact. So is it a schedule in the business plan that I should be looking for? Thanks, Mr. Chair. Oh, maybe it's Schedule 4.
Minister, you're Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's under the business plan. Sorry, there, Minister, Member O'Reilly. Page 221. Main estimates. Ones that we're going through today.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to stop the clock here for a minute. So we're going to figure out what we're looking for here. So it is on, in what document is the Minister referencing? Is it the main estimates or is it the public business plans? Minister.
Main estimates, page 221, first line, Aboriginal Mineral Development Support Programs, and then other contributions as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Page 221.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. So is the minister then telling me that there's additional contributions to the N.W.T. Chamber of Mines that are found in this Aboriginal Mineral Development Support Program of $100,000? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not all of it, but some of it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So can the minister provide to Standing Committee then a list of the financial support that's provided to the N.W.T. Chamber of Mines, say for 2016-17 and 2017-18? Just if I can't determine how much support's been given, so could the minister put those figures together and just provide it to the Standing Committee? That's probably the easiest thing to do. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we'll do that for the member. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Maybe just one last question. The oil and gas strategy, when is that going to be made available to Standing Committee? 'Cause I think it's been a long time since we've commented on some earlier versions. So when is the next version going to appear? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As things are rolling out, we plan to try to have that in front of committee by early April. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Time for one last question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This Could probably be a short one here. In regards to the oil and gas symposium in Calgary, has the department looked, I realize the minister's not going and staff are, have they reached out to some of the Aboriginal communities and invited them to go to that conference? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. or Minister.
These are the regional people, right?
We haven't reached out to them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to answer the member's question specifically, we haven't reached out to bring them like we normally would have, like we did last year, or go to AME type roundup type of thing that we just did in Vancouver. In this particular case, we haven't done that because of the state of the oil and gas economy in the Northwest Territories. We're going to be coming out with our petroleum resource strategy here in the near future. And as I've said in this House, we're looking at concentrating on how we're going to use this resource locally the best we can. At the same time, figure out how we can use the strategy to find a way to market and get infrastructure investment so we can market this to a broader audience. But at this particular time in the downturn of this industry, no, we have not reached out to take participants to it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the minister for that answer. But I guess I know in my writing, especially in the Fort Liard area, in the past, the government has invited them to go to the conference, and it's been a big, I guess, very supportive for the community and something for future. So I guess my question is, I understand, that we're doing a plan and a strategy and that, but would we not want to invite or engage, the communities that wish to be down there and support them to go there presently? So will the minister look at, potentially working with Fort Liard to send somebody or a contingency down there? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing stopping any of these people to reach out to us and see if we would be willing to assist them to do that. There's our regional offices that they can approach for support to do that. But my concern on this initiative, as I've said, let's take the Liard Basin for an example. The Petronas has walked away from the LNG plant on the west coast. There seems to be significant challenges on getting this product to market, not just for us, but all of Canada. The commodity price went from $11 at one point down to $1.90, and it's fluctuated in a zone there where it's very unattractive for investment in our region right now. And we continue to monitor these things, and when we roll out our strategy, we're still trying to figure out how we can market this. A lot of these things are out of our control. They're a global entity that's going to control how we get these things to market. So there's a lot of challenges around that, but there is some opportunities, like I said, maybe going forward, how do we get these things to regional centers and use it the best we can for Northerners, and we will continue to look at that. But I know that's a long-winded answer of saying that the people in Fort Liard can reach out to our regional staff and see if there's a way for us to support them going to this show, but that's the short answer, I guess. Long answer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought this was going to be a short Q&A here, but it's got a little bit longer. So I appreciate the minister providing that opportunity, and I will pass that on to, the leadership in Fort Liard, that they can reach out to the regional staff there and see what can be done. So I thank the minister for that. I understand the challenges that we see, but again, that community needs to find work, and they're trying to get this done. So I greatly appreciate it. So it's just more of a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Everyone has been given an opportunity to speak to this. I will now call this activity Minerals and Petroleum Resources, Operations Expenditure Summary, activity total $15,780,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Moving on, Tourism and Parks. This activity begins on page 223, continues to page 226. Does committee have comments or questions? Tourism and Parks. Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate seeing in here that the Yellowknife Visitor Services is going to continue to get a contribution of $161,000 this year to not allow for any gap in visitor services, which is appreciated. I respect that there are other initiatives being undertaken by the government as it relates to legislation that will be coming forward to help support the City of Yellowknife with regard to enabling them to allow them to establish the organizational destination, or organization OBM. Sorry, I forget the acronym now, but anyway, I'm thankful with the government's contribution to the city as it relates to visitor services and tourism. But that said, I would like to ask the department, we have a considerable uptake right now on tour operators in the city. And it was been brought to my attention recently that out-of-town operators are exploiting this opportunity. Can the department maybe let us know, is there some kind of inspection and or maybe application process or what have you that an operator has to undertake in order to do business in the Northwest Territories or the City of Yellowknife for that matter as it relates to being a tour operator? I guess more in particular, the Aurora Viewing tour operators was the specific concern that was raised with me, that there's Alberta companies coming in and conducting business, and the concern is that A, they're maybe not members of the N.W.T. Tourism, B, they might not have the appropriate licenses. Is the department aware of this, and is there anything that we can do to make sure that if you're going to come and do business here, then you've got to be established and fulfill all the proper requirements? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we do have our regional office that goes out and conducts our inspections. The other one that we got that we've talked about in this House beginning in April is we're going to have the tourism operators that are going to have a safety plan going forward. Every one of them is going to have to be able to produce that. But as far as outside operators, particularly as the member said from outside of the territory, nothing like that has come to my attention, and I would gladly sit down and have that conversation if that is taking place in the N.W.T. And maybe it's something that's going to have to happen if they are operating here without the proper certificates between ourselves and the City of Yellowknife. We're going to have a look at it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Van Thyn.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the minister might not be aware of this fully, and frankly, it's just recently been brought to my attention as well. But maybe I'll ask, if the department is going to be working a tourist safety plan with each of the operators, how do they know which operators that, the minister said all of them are going to have to take this training. How do we know who all of them are? Or is it because of some kind of registry, or is it just because they've taken out business licenses, or is it just because they're members of N.W.T. Tourism? How is it that they're going to be able to determine who all of them are? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Jensen.
Mr. Chair, certainly we have a list of all of the tourism operators who have a license with us, and we require that they have safety plans as part of that. There's a safety guidance document that's available. In terms of are there operators who are operating in the territory that are unlicensed? Well, we have people who would, officers who would hopefully hear about that. We've actually heard from other licensed tourism operators, if there is an operator who's operating and is unlicensed, the community knows who they are, they know each other, and we have certainly have examples of hearing from legitimate licensed tourism operators who know of some that are operating without a license, and we have acted on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, well then, I appreciate that. Then I guess the question is, if they're not registered and if they're not going to take the safety plan, what are the repercussions for an operator that's going to be providing tourism services in the Northwest Territories? And I'm not talking about just someone from down south now. I'm talking about anyone who might not be registered and might not take the safety training. So what are if we've done our inspection and we find some of these people that are these operators that haven't undertaken these initiatives and haven't registered themselves with ITI, then what are the repercussions or penalties that one might expect if they're not registered or haven't taken the safety plan? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The safety plans going forward is a condition of your TOL, so if you don't have your safety plan in place, I suspect that you aren't going to get your tourist operating license and you'll be forced to shut down. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Van Thyn.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, that's the point I'm trying to raise then. You're saying forced to shut down. What does that look like? Is this you're asked to leave town if you're from out of town, your vehicles get confiscated, your tour buses, or you're handed a fine, or I'm just trying to understand so that I can report back to those who raise the concern with me. What is the details, or have we drafted any kind of penalties, or is there any kind of repercussions specifically that someone would be dealt if they weren't registered and didn't take the safety training? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Thyn. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, first, I'll have to go back to the department and see exactly what would be, if you're non-compliant, what would actions be taken. But I suspect we'll be working closely with the city of Yellowknife, because most of these guys are going to have a business license to be able to conduct business within the municipality of City of Yellowknife as well. So there must be some measures in place between the two of us that would shut down an organization. But I'll have to get more details and get back to the member. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Van Thyn.
Okay, that would be appreciated as much as you could provide on that. I have a few different operators in my riding that would appreciate knowing that detail. No further questions at this point on this activity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Van Thyn. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple questions. A lot of people in my riding ask me about why the parks in the South Slave close generally earlier, well, at least last year, I believe, earlier than any other parks in the territory. And I was wondering if the minister could give me an explanation as to why that is. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I've stated in the House before, this was a part of our normal operations and our seasonal operations and the amount of money that was allocated to it. But I made a commitment in the House when our parks went out to tender that we would have an option on there to have the parks operators give us a price for an additional timeline, and would we take that into consideration if we'd be able to extend the hours of operation and length of time that they'd be open. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed those tenders have gone out. Can the minister confirm that that option was included on there? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll have to follow up and make sure that that was in there, but I couldn't give the member a direct answer right now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I generally ask the same questions in committee that I ask in when we're doing business planning, just for future reference. The answer I was kind of looking for is that part of the problem is that there's technical reasons why they don't stay open. You know, it gets cold and there's infrastructure that needs to be, that can't freeze, right? They're not winterized, so the plumbing freezes, things like that. So I would appreciate an answer like that. So does the department know how much it would cost to winterize some of these properties so that they can stay open, you know, even a few weeks or a month past what they're staying open now? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have that type of detail here, but we can have a look at what that would cost. I'd probably need more specifics from the member about the time frame he's thinking. I made the commitment in the House that we would change those tenders, what it would take to keep these parks open a couple weeks longer in the end of the year, because I hear this ongoing concern from a number of people, and particularly both our ridings of A River, that want to be able to access these things. But we can have a look and see what it would cost. But I would like to, maybe the member ask me a specific length of time that we'd want us to consider. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess the issue is that the campgrounds are built for summer. They're not built for winter. And so there's what would it cost to get them up to standards where everything's not going to freeze, you're not going to have all this damage if there's a cold spell when they're open later. But I mean, I understand that's technical. I'm not looking for an answer for that right now. But that's the kind of stuff that, you know, looking forward, it would be nice to investigate so that, because I know both of our, my constituency meeting and the constituency meeting for the MLA from Hay River South, they always end and talks about tourism and parks and why we can't keep the campgrounds open longer. So I'd like to have a bit of follow-up on that at a later date from the minister. If you give me 1 second here, I'll turn to the correct section. I noticed that there's no mention, the tourism industry contribution is for marketing and industry association support to N.W.T. tourism. Where is that money spent? I know that they say we never see the ads for N.W.T. tourism because they're in Vancouver, they're advertising elsewhere in the country. Can we get a little bit of detail about how that money is spent? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman. Minister Schuman.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that money is split up between core funding and marketing, and if you look in I'll reference the grants and contribution book again as well, page 31 for 2016-17. Page 31 will lay out, 31 and 32 will lay out exactly where most of that money went. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can tell it's been a long day for the minister. He's getting quieter and quieter. I didn't quite hear that answer, but I can look in Hansard to find out where that information is. I believe that's all I have for this section right now. Yeah, this is all I have right now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I can vouch for how great some of those parks are on the other side of the lake, because I've stayed in all of them. But there's some great parks on this side of the lake as well. Fred Henney, Prelude, Reed Lake, all of which our family has used. So what is the department looking at in terms of keeping some of those open longer into the fall. And part of the reason I raise this is they've already do it in the Yukon. They have tremendous road traffic through there. I've used their parks past the usual closing date, and they, from what I've seen and understand, they get great usage of those parks even into October. So what are we looking at doing for the parks on this side of the lake, and was that included in the tender documents that went out to have that as an option? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Schumann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is my mic working? Can you hear it? Okay. So first of all, we got to take this into context, because if we go down this road, this is going to cost the territorial government a significant amount of money. We have a limited amount of capital within the ITI budget to do this across a territorial-wide initiative. One of the things I think that we'd have to even consider before we end up doing this, and we are doing some stuff in the North Slave around the winter aurora there, keeping our parking lots open and the washroom facilities as such, and that's costing us some extra money. But, you know, when you start looking at a territorial-wide initiative to do this, we're talking like probably millions of dollars to be able to transition to keeping these things open in the wintertime. These buildings aren't made to a winter specification. They're made for seasonal operations, but also for value for money. You know, some of these parks are not going to have any types of visitors, next to nothing probably in some of them, depending on where they're located. So this would be an initiative that would have to have a very serious look at to even consider doing this. I did say we would have, I didn't say we were going to keep them open longer in the Hay River region, but I wanted to have a feeling what it would cost to keep these things open for a couple of weeks maybe. That's why I asked a member from Hay River North, what type of time frame is he talking? Are we talking a couple of weeks here? Or are we talking 3 or 4 months? There's a big difference in this type of initiative and the costs that would be associated with it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the minister's boundless enthusiasm for this idea. Look, I'm not asking for the entire park system to be open all winter, but maybe you could start with a few pilot projects, having 2 or 3 different parks open at least 3 or 4 weeks or something into the fall, and then you can look at maybe some other options. But can the minister commit to come to committee with a few options that might be costed out to look at piloting this idea of extending the season? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't agree to that, but I think what I would agree to, I think, is because we've already done a pilot project on this in the Daycho region. We've just done it in the Blackstone this year, and maybe let the department pull that information together and see what the value for money we got, how many people actually went in the extended season, what it cost us to do that, and that'll give us some idea, at least on one particular park, what it's cost us to do just in one region. But for the north side of the lake here, we've also had our North Arm Park engagement process, which is the department has gone out and to get feedback on how we can look at maybe changing how we operate things in the North Slave here, and we'll have. I think we can probably share that, or if we haven't shared it already, with the committee going forward on that one as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, how about let's start with something really small then. How about keeping the boat launch at Fred Henney open past the Labor Day weekend? It's not even part of the park. There's a separate gate. What about starting with something really small like that? This is an area that's well used by Yellowknifers. Can the minister look at keeping that open into into September, later in September, so residents of Yellowknife can continue to boat on the lake? That's something really small. I don't think that's going to cost a lot of money, but let's hear what the minister has to say. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, we can certainly look at doing an initiative like that. But like I said, we'll pull some numbers together on this pilot project that we did in the Blackstone there in the Fort Simpson territorial parks, and get some of that information to committee as well too. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the commitment of the minister to do that. I just want to turn to Yellowknife Visitor Services. So it's $161,000 as shown on page 225. That's actually less than the cost of the visitor center in Dawson City, Yukon, which I don't know how many visitors they get, but we seem to get a lot of visitors in Yellowknife now. Is the minister looking at increasing support for tourism in Yellowknife, the visitor services, beyond $161,000 a year? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's a bit early to make a decision on that yet. We are working with the City of Yellowknife to determine the long-term model delivery of the Visitor Information Center, and to Minister Van Time, it's DMO, his acronym that he was trying to figure out there. We need to pull all these things together, and we will be working very closely with the city moving forward and see what supports are going to be needed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think I heard the minister say that he's open then to receiving more information about how the designated marketing organization is going to roll out and what additional support our government might provide to help support the burgeoning tourism industry here in Yellowknife. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I said, we're working with the city to determine the long-term model of the delivery of the Tourism Information Center, and we'll work closely with the City of Yellowknife and keep the committee informed on where this initiative is going. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so I'm sure he's prepared to work with his colleague, the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs, to get that City, Towns and Villages Act change before the House, so we can they can start to build up the destination marketing organization pot. But maybe the minister can tell us too what's happening with the old visitor center that's boarded up just a few hundred meters from this building. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The infrastructure side of things, the department is having a look at it. We had a couple of consultants assess the building and develop options for the future of the building, and hopefully we'll have the final reports completed with detailed review of engineering options and costs related to that fairly soon. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Can the minister share those reports then with Standing Committee? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll find out if there's no types of conflicts, so certainly we can do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I really do think that anybody who's walked in downtown Yellowknife these days knows how active the tourism sector is. We have tourists walking in our neighborhood now. I live on Forest Drive, and they're walking in the neighborhood for things to do. So we've got to find a better way to provide services for the tourists that do come here, and we want to make sure that they're made welcome and that they have more activities to do than just walking around in neighborhoods, which is fine if they want to learn about Yellowknife, but I'm sure we can do a lot better. Thanks, Mr. Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you. Any closing comments from the minister on that? Nothing from the minister. Anything further from committee? Seeing none, I will call this activity. Tourism and Parks, Operations Expenditure Summary, $16,290,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Committee, that is the end of our activities. There are 4 information items on pages 227 to 234. Members can have an opportunity to speak once to these items as a whole. Mr. O'Reilly, you have 10 minutes to speak to the information items on pages 227 to 234.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't think I'm going to need 10 minutes, but I guess some of it's going to depend on the minister's answers. Page 230, the Environmental Studies Research Fund. Are there actually any oil and gas leases out there that pay levies into this fund anymore? Because given the total lack of any activity, are there any levies continuing to come in here? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is the levies are still coming in and the rates are staying at the same as they were last year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I probably should have had a closer look at this myself before I asked the question. But 230, 2018-19 shows a revenue of zero, or just a line. But in the previous 2 years, either the revised estimates or the actuals were $292,000. So what's happening in 2018-19? Have all of those leases been given up, surrendered, or is there any revenues coming in? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Munchin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's basically a timing situation on when the levies are issued to interest holders and when they're reflected in this particular schedule. So in the 18-19 revised estimates, the amount for that calendar, they're issued in the first quarter of a calendar year. So it's just basically a timing situation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Munchin. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So if I wasn't confused before, I certainly am now. So the department then anticipates $292,000 coming in, but it's just going to happen at the end of the first quarter of 2018-19? And if so, why wouldn't the figure be put in here? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As Ms. Moitchin said, it's a timing issue, and we should be able to maybe provide the actual number closer to the end of March, end of this quarter, what the actual number will be. But we anticipate it's probably going to be less than the 292 you see here because there's less hectares. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay, thanks. Can the minister then commit to provide that information to committee? And I'm just curious to know sort of what the levy is, how many leaseholders are out there, or the areas that are under lease. I'm sure that stuff could be put together in a table, and could that be provided to committee? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister.
Yes, we can do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that commitment from the minister. And I've expressed some concerns about in the past about how representative and accountable the board is that administers this fund. It consists of government representatives and industry representatives. I think there's supposed to be one public representative, but is all of that going to be up for reconsideration when the Petroleum Resources Act comes up for review? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I believe that will be part of the PRA review. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the commitment of the minister on that one, and I think that's all I have for this portion of the budget. Sorry, one other on 227 is BDIC, and the accumulated surplus is shown on the bottom of the page there. Is this the amount that the minister is talking about changing or allowing the corporation to use as part of its program dollars that they're not authorized to do right now? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, that is correct. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you. There are no further comments from committee on pages, what pages were they? 227 to 234, the information items. Oh no, those were, sorry, 227 to 231 were the information items. Seeing none, we can move back to the activity or the departmental total on page 207. And the departmental total, along with associated information, including revenues and positions, is found on pages 204 to 209. Do we have comments, questions? Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My questions are on 208, the revenues. Minerals, oil, and gas royalties. Were there any oil and gas royalties for 2018-19? Or are there any oil and gas royalties predicted for 2018-19? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll have to check with the department and get back to the member on that one. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that would be helpful to know. So the licenses, rental, and other fees, can someone just tell me what those are comprised of? Is that money that's, yeah, can someone just explain a little bit more about what that is? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That line item includes revenue from mining recorder's office of rentals, prospecting license, permit fees, claim fees, and other administrative fees related to the registry documents. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So yeah, it's declined precipitously from over $20 million in 2016-17 to $2.3 million. So does this just reflect a lot less activity that's going on? Thanks, Mr. Chair. Or have we reduced fees or something here? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was the bid deposit stuff from the SAT2 that was forfeited. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. O'Reilly.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think the minister's referring to the large total for 2016-17. So that was, I don't know, MGM or something that decided not to proceed with exploration, so they forfeited a large amount of money. Is that what that is? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't say who they were, but we can give committee who detail item list of that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I guess my last point, and I don't really expect a response necessarily from the minister, but you know, and I've already said this before, we raise more revenues now from tobacco taxes than the oil and gas and mining royalties. We get $16 million in tobacco taxes. For mining, oil, and gas royalties, we get 13.4, maybe 13.5 million dollars. The Liquor Commission revenues are $24.7 million, about twice what we get from mining and oil and gas royalties. So this, to me, demonstrates the need for us to examine how we collect these revenues and whether they're appropriate or not, and whether we're getting a fair share of the revenues from oil and gas and mining. So I don't understand why this is being delayed till the next assembly, but then again, I don't expect a response from the minister. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister Schuman.
I'll take it as a comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. O'Reilly, that was no more. Thank you. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 208, there's a line item, egg marketing levy. There is no money attached to it this year, but in previous years, I see in 2017-18, there was $35,000. So for those people who don't know, the commercial egg market is supply managed. That means there's a commercial production is regulated federally. Producers are allocated a quota through a designated body, the Egg Producers of Canada. In the N.W.T, the N.W.T is actually the holder of that quota. So they don't produce eggs, though. I guess they allow other producers to produce eggs. This line item here is the egg marketing levy. As the name suggests, that is money coming from the Egg Farmers of Canada. That money comes from the egg producers in the territory through the Egg Farmers of Canada back to the holder of the quota, which is the N.W.T, and is supposed to be used for marketing and made in the N.W.T eggs. But in the past years, it's just gone into the N.W.T's general coffers. And I'm not quite sure this is because we do produce eggs in the territory. And there's a farm, there's a end supplier, there's a board. Everything's in place here, yet this money, even though it's not much money, it goes into the general coffers and does not go to the Egg Producers Board so they can actually advertise made in the N.W.T eggs. That's why you never see a made in the N.W.T eggs advertisement anywhere. You don't see like stand-up built posters in the grocery store. You don't see ads in magazines unless the people have paid for them out of their own pocket. And so this year there is no money attached to this, and I'm of the understanding that's because the Agricultural Products Marketing Council has been reinstated by the N.W.T. And in the regulations, this marketing money, for some reason, goes to this Agricultural Products Marketing Council, which is a body that I believe is intended to settle disputes in the industry. I'm not sure if there are disputes, but this is all something that can be clarified here once I'm done my question, or the setup, I guess. So this money that's coming from the egg marketing levy is going to fund this board instead of going to promote N.W.T eggs. And so I guess my question is, why is that the case? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the member stated that he said it was for marketing. This money is not for that. With the reestablishment of the Agricultural Products Marketing Council, which oversees the system in N.W.T and ensures that arm's length and objective of the council, this money is for the operations of that council. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. So it's a marketing council. So the only money they're getting, I believe, is from the egg marketing levy. So are other agricultural producers, are they contributing to this as well? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We don't have any other producers, so it's all coming from the egg producer board. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
So there's a egg producers board who's producing a product, and so what the N.W.T did was created another council that would do the marketing for the egg producers board. Why doesn't the egg producers board just do the marketing like they've been asking to? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman. Mr. Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think there's a bit of confusion around the term marketing. This Agricultural Products Marketing Council is set up to oversee the system in N.W.T. to ensure that it's arm's length and objective. So it's an oversight board as opposed to, I would argue, a direct marketing responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen. Mr. Simpson?
Thank you. So then once again, this board isn't for marketing. Why is the money for egg marketing going to support this board that's for oversight? That it's a GNWT board, and I believe there's ITI employees on there as well, so it's not even that arm's length. So why is the money from the egg producers marketing, why is the money there, why are they paying for the GNWT's board, I guess is my question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Deputy Minister Jensen.
Mr. Chair, it's a board that independently oversees the operations of to make sure that the system we have here is objective, that it's transparent. The N.W.T. Egg Producers Board, it's in place to promote and market N.W.T. eggs, not just those of one producer. So it is responsible for marketing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Minister Jensen. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the N.W.T. Egg Producers Board is responsible for promoting made in the N.W.T. eggs, as I stated. There happens to be one producer, but they still can only promote made in the N.W.T. eggs. And so it's still confusing why the money for the egg marketing levy is not going to the egg producers to market their eggs. It's going to a GNWT oversight board. And it's from regulations from 1999, 20 years ago almost. So maybe it's time to look at those regulations and look at how the industry has changed, and maybe those need to be changed as well. What's the minister's take on that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things we've got to take into consideration here is this is early days for this arm's length board, and they will. They're just convening just lately, we've just put these people in place, and I'm sure as these things come up, they will come back to us, and we'll have a look at it and what role we can take and play in doing to try to maybe correct some of these things going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that it's sort of early days in terms of the agricultural strategy, and we're trying to get everything all set up and move forward with this. So perhaps the minister would agree to sit down with me and members of the egg board whenever he's back in Hay River, and we can sort of discuss this issue and maybe figure out collaboratively a way to come up with a solution. Would the minister be open to that? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Minister Schuman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I would gladly do that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister Schuman. Anything further, Mr. Simpson?
Nothing further.
Further questions? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm just looking at page 208, the revenue summary. And I'd like to ask just some questions about some of the lines we see here. First, on the nominee program, in the 16-17 actuals, it was at 42,000. And now we see the proposed budget and last fiscal year was half, or not half, but near half that amount. So what explains the drop from 16-17 to 17-18? Thank you. Mr. Chair?
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The fees have remained at a historical budget at our current plan. Nominee program revenue is for the application fees, and the budget is based on an estimated number of applicants in any year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart?
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we are currently then, so in 16-17 we had double the amount, we budgeted double the amount of applicants. Okay, sorry. Yeah, oh, those are the actuals, okay. So again, in 16, 17, we had nearly twice the amount that we budgeted for in the preceding year. So what explains is the drop in those number of applicants? That's what I'm looking for, is how do we understand? I understand how the budget works, our budgeting works for this program, but why did we lose so many applicants when the program was doing so well? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So these are just estimates, and we are glad to see these numbers exceed the forecast. So the actuals on that particular year for 42 was the actuals, but we continue to forecast 22. And if these numbers continue to climb, well, maybe we'll look at raising that actual number. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So on to the tourism operators licenses. Again, we're seeing, it just seems odd that this number isn't growing with the success of the tourism industry and the number of operators. I often hear that there's a lot of competition out there for new operators who are coming in to take advantage of the tourism market. Are we not predicting any new operations applying for licenses? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This line item is very similar to what's happened with the nominee program. It's a historical number, but we're looking at increasing that because the number of applicants has actually gone up a little bit here already, and we'll continue to revise these numbers as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you. Can the minister account for the difference in mineral oil and gas royalties? I know some of these issues were raised, but if he could just clearly account for the difference between the 17-18 revised estimates and this year's estimates. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So these numbers are done on a quarterly basis. We base the royalty forecast prepared by the Diamond and Royalties Financial Analysis Division. The model uses the mining regulations, uses historical data and forward-looking information from companies based on publicly available information. Forecast change as the market and mine plans change, including rough, diamond prices, and foreign exchange. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you to the minister for providing the technical details of how it's calculated, but I'm looking for the reasons why there's a drop from 31 million to 13. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can't talk about any specific operation, but I can say that it's, bringing forward eligible expenses all in 1 year, where instead of having it spread over a number of years, and that's what was the big impact on that line item. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to speak to an issue that I unfortunately wasn't allowed to or wasn't able to ask questions on in a previous section, but I'll just flip over to 207, the departmental total, and just ask about the manufacturing strategy. What money has been attached to the manufacturing strategy in this budget? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've been currently funding that from within the ITI budget. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
By how much? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have that detail in front of me. I'll get that information for the member. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find it difficult when witnesses respond in this manner to say, well, we have money, but I can't tell you what it is or where you can find it. I would hope the minister would have a more satisfactory answer, but I will remain unsatisfied. On the manufacturing strategy, what is the progress to date on the consultation engagement and drafting of that strategy? The progress made to date. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We went out and did our public engagement in a number of communities across the Northwest Territories. We were going to be pulling together what we heard report, and hopefully that is going to be done in the very near future, and we'll be able to table that probably in the up and coming session or post it online before the next session starts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate, I was involved in that process, and I appreciate the work that's going into that. One of the areas that is up for discussion in the strategic discussions around manufacturing is converting the current list policy, where you have to be registered as a manufacturer to receive the preferential purchasing, shifting that to a labor market subsidy, so you actually subsidize manufacturing operations to encourage employment. And I think that's a viable option that is perhaps preferable to the current system. If that example was undertaken, it will require, an additional source of cash. There's a whole host of other options that might require additional funding as well. Is this funding from within that the minister spoke of able to account for any of those kind of changes that we might roll out with the manufacturing strategy? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the member's right. That's one of the initiatives that we're looking at. The money that we're using currently within ITI is funds to do the survey and how do we promote the industry. But moving forward, if that's a path that we end up taking on labor market subsidies, we'll have to come back to this assembly and figure out how much money we're going to need to do that and which department will be leading that initiative, if it's a labor initiative through education or if it's through business promotion through ITI, but that is something that's going to have to be costed out and figured out if that's the way we go with this strategy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Thank you. So given the fiscal challenges presented in this budget, is it likely that, or is the minister anticipating that there'll be an opportunity to bring forward a supplementary appropriation, or are those resources spoken for? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Mr. Chair, it's probably too early to make a commitment on that. We depend on where this whole strategy ends up and how it rolls out. I couldn't comment if that's how we would roll it out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart.
Nothing further. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Seeing nothing, I will call the departmental total. Industry, tourism, and investment, total department, $57,420,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Does committee agree that this concludes our consideration of industry, tourism, and investment? Thank you, committee. Thank you, Minister, and thank you to your witnesses. Sergeant at Arms, you may escort the witnesses from the chamber. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the chair of committee of the whole leave the chair to report progress.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion to report progress. The motion is in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress. Thank you.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 63-18(3) main estimates 2018-2019 and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the committee of the whole be concurred with.
Must see. Do I have a seconder? Member for Mackenzie Delta. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Must see. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Tuesday, February 27th, 2018, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, reports of standing and special committees, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 1-18.3, Minister Statement 19-18.3, Minister Statement 32-18.3, table document 63-18.3, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
This House stands adjourned until Tuesday, February 27, 2018, 1:30 p.m.